Hello, my name is James, and yeah, I'll be doing my talk on game design and print and play and zines and all that fun stuff. So why am I doing this talk in the first place? It's because I think that games are actually a lot harder to make than a lot of people give credit for, and a lot more inaccessible than people give credit for, especially if you're outside of the gaming sphere, right? Like if you don't have a strong laptop or computer, you need to go out and buy like a good enough computer. There's hardware limitations involved with that. It's not very accessible. Like let's say you go from here to there, you spend a lot of time away from your desktop, then it's hard to create games on the fly. Making games from start to finish, this is a big one, is a huge time commitment, right? You have to do the sound, you have to do the visuals, you have to do the programming, you have to make everything. And just like all this other stuff on the right is kind of all together, right? Like designing games is hard, it's a new field, people don't know what they're doing, it's hard to practice. So throughout this talk, I hope to convince you that print and play is like a way to make games that is fast and iterative enough for you to like practice your game design skills the way, for example, an artist might sketch. Yeah, as I said, the solution to not being able to produce games in a short enough time frame and hence not practice your ability is to make games quickly and in a format that emphasizes systems and removing everything else that gets in the way. And so when you strip print and play games down to their bare bones, there's no coding required, it's paper. You technically don't need art skills, even though it can make it look pretty. You physically can't do animation, so a lot of the games are just stripped down to like, hey, here's a piece of paper with instructions for a human being. This is like the systems of the game. Before we get into like the pros and cons, I just want to talk a bit about the history and why I think it's good for games in general. The general running theme you'll see throughout the history of zines is that it's independent, it's very indie. So in the 1930s, it started out as like this fan-made magazine for science fiction. It was independently published using a mimeograph, which is pictured here. But it was kind of like this niche, fringe thing that people didn't really care for until the 40s, and especially the late 40s. This is when fanzines became more of a big thing, and when fanzines and zines in general started to become a bit more like outside of fandom, right? Like for things like people who are left on the fringe by society, such as at the time LGBTQ people and such. And this kind of also started to cement zines as a way for marginalized people to spread their voices, or a way for people who are suppressed, by like other powers to get their voices heard. So in the 1950s and 60s, we saw the zines spread away from like this fringe thing into more palatable things like music cultures and whatnot. Even within the context of like, hey, music is this thing that everyone likes, it stayed on the fringe. At the time, rock and roll was kind of seen as an outcast sort of genre, and that's when it was popular to popularize rock and roll. Also, the origin of zines, sci-fi, still went strong. Just goes to show you the power of these things. And in the 1970s, there was the printing shop. So, if you go to like any random corner and you can print your piece of paper on A4, you can do that nowadays. That started in the 70s. And that's when we saw zines start to be like more popular, like for more fringe movements, as opposed to a small subculture thing. It now became like a movement thing for like punk and whatnot. And in the 90s to 2000s, we saw this like really popularized movements that really pushed for societal changes forward. Basically, as I said, all this has to do with like people being on the fringe, people being indie, people kind of doing their own thing and minding their own business, and trying to get that out to as many people as possible. Sources for that. So why did I just talk about fanzines if we're here making games, right? So this is basically the takeaway I got from fanzines, and eventually fanzines would then evolve and develop to become print and play, which is where you take a PDF file online and you print it and you play the game yourself. So when zines and print and play overlap, or when one transfer to the other, is very much not defined. A lot of it is up in the air, but that doesn't matter to us. What matters is that there is an overlap of this kind of like independent expression that allows people to make games on their own, to print and play on their own. So some of you might be asking, like, what is it? It's basically a PDF file that anyone can print out. There's like a bunch of things that come with printing, right? A lot of things don't matter nowadays. So before RGB versus CMYK might have mattered, it doesn't. The DPI technically doesn't matter. This is just to make it look good. And the whole idea, again, as I said, you just write rules. You iterate on it a lot. You make a lot of games this way. This is my own print and play game. So this is like a potential of what it could look like. you can see that there's like an instruction sheet, which kind of like tells people how to play the game, traditional stuff, as well as 2 PDFs that players can cut out and kind of use to play the game themselves. Usually the less cutting out, the better, but this doesn't matter if you're only doing it for practice, right? The sketching equivalent as opposed to like the final product equivalent. So because print-to-play games are a physical medium, you can do them anywhere. That's kind of like the big thing. You can just pick up a piece of paper, pick up pen or pencil, just scribble around, see what happens. You can really quickly prototype layouts, and you can very quickly see what mechanics work and what doesn't work. And because of the accessibility of printing nowadays, you can kind of pay a shop like $2 to print it in black and white. And if you want to, you can also just scan what you've drawn and like print that. Before I move on, actually, the big difference between a paper prototype and a print and play is that a print and play is its own holistic thing. It's its own game from start to finish, whereas a paper prototype usually is a prototype for something that will eventually be not paper, right? Like a video game. So there's a lot of categories in print and play. You can kind of do whatever you want. There's the big three, which is card-based games, board-based games, and TTRPG. So card-based games use cards. Board-based games is any other physical medium that doesn't use cards. And TTRPGs usually just takes place in your head. There are physical components involved with it sometimes, but it's not as big of a deal. There's also some abstract experimental genres. I couldn't find any mainstream example of them, but they're there if you want to do something artsy. And yeah, as I said before, the main difference between a paper prototype and a print and play is that a print and play is meant to be like a start to finish product, right? So should you polish it? The answer depends on you. If you feel like you want to make a game from start to finish, complete, like a holistic thing that you can proudly show to other people, yes, you should. Print and play games are games after all. They're not like lesser by any means. And there's also a bunch of advantages to having it like more real. But there's also reasons to not finish it, right? Like, as I said, print and play is a really good exercise in your design skills. You make the print and play game and you play it out, and you can just put that to the side. You can make a print and play of just like certain mechanics within a game, put that to the side, have that on like a shelf, for example, and take it out for like when you're making your next real game. It basically depends on whether you want to make this a final product or not. Sounds obvious, but that's what this is. And because print and plays have a strong association with zines, you can put them together. So originally, my game was supposed to be this. It was supposed to have excerpts of like lore and snippets of like world building associated with the thing. And keep in mind that zines are meant to be like in a booklet format or a book format. And having this extra layer of like lore and world building can lead to a much more polished, complete print and play game. Again, if that's not what you're aiming for, you can ignore that point. Again, with zines, it's always been about expressing yourself. Having a print and play zine mixture allows you to express yourself in such a way. And on a final note, make shit. Like, just make stuff. Like, the whole point of this talk, I guess, is just to raise awareness of different ways to make games that are easier. I feel like if you want to do game design, or if you want to make games or be better at systems, there's no excuse not to. If that's something that doesn't interest you, you can ignore this whole talk, obviously. But I feel like having or raising awareness for a method that's so easy to iterate upon and to make final products is a great way to just like get people to make stuff, right? I also want to kind of iterate that making a print and play game isn't any less than making a video game or a mobile game or a board game. Just make stuff, make it, print it, share it, whatever. Especially because this is so low stakes. It's a great way to express who you are. No finances involved. Let's do it.